channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Silver Tempest, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be looking at GLC, a bit of an update video. I haven't done one of these since Astral Radiance, and I do think it's probably makes a bit of sense to leave a few gaps here and there between sets before doing GLC updates, because sometimes there's only a handful of interesting cards. But I think now that we've got Lost Origin, Silver Tempest, and Pokemon Go inclusions, as well as the new ban from Amazing Rare Kyogre, I thought it was a pretty good time to once again talk about GLC and give some updates into what cards we could be adding into our GLC decks based on each type that we're going to be playing. Just a quick note on the Kyogre ban. I think it's definitely a correct decision. The Amazing Surge was a build around that simply many archetypes in the GLC couldn't have any counterplay to because they didn't have bench protection. And because it was this wombo combo that even if they recycled a Kyogre once, usually it had to surge twice to win the game. And that was just a real feels bad moment. So I think it's a correct decision to see this go. I'm still campaigning for maybe a handful of other cards that could be on the watch list. But as of right now, I do think the banning of Kyogre is creating a better play environment for GLC. Let's have a look at some general additions then. And I do think there are some that can be splashed into all sorts of different archetypes. The Arizu supporter being very strong at grabbing evolution Pokemon. And there are a number of Stage 2 based engines and attackers, obviously, of course, in the GLC. So any of these archetypes that play multiple Stage 2 lines could really take advantage of this. So I am really happy to see this supporter come in. I do think it's a little bit weaker than a Bull Guy, but I do think that following up from a Gloria or a Bridget or even a Bull Guy in those opening stages, this is a fantastic play just to springboard off that, get into your not only your draw engine Pokemon, but ideally into some of the sort of stage 2s that you're trying to build at the same time. So I think this is a phenomenal inclusion for a number of sort of setup based builds that have many realistically stage 2 Pokemon in their list. Now, Lost City is a stadium that I'm actually kind of terrified of, and I think this is immediately going onto the watch list because when we are playing a singleton format and you score knockouts and put sometimes your opponent's most important sort of build-around style Pokemon into that Lost Zone, inaccessible for them to touch again, that's going to have a real bad feeling. But, of course, it's a two-sided effect, so you come at your opponent with your own risk, you put the Lost City in, try and knock out one of their more integral pieces, and hope that whatever your opponent then chooses to knock you out with, it's not going to be too punishing on your own. So I do think it actually warps the meta a little bit. I think we might be seeing some Lusamine sneaking into more and more decks alongside this Lost City, because it is so crazy to target certain engine Pokemon like Frostmoth in water, Eels in lightning, or just the Raikou, the best sort of attacker in lightning, or just target this, that, and the other, and just completely remove that from play. Doesn't matter what sort of, Claras or Rods, anything they have to recycle stuff, it's really punishing. So I think Lost City is pretty much a mainstay in almost every deck. I think it's so crazy, honestly, that, yeah, this card is on the watch list. It can create really crazy openings in all sorts of matchups where the prize race isn't necessarily the most important way to win a game. If you can pick apart key parts of your opponent's board, you can end up just sweeping as they are left with not much else beyond that. So yeah, the stadium card is monstrous for GLC and really is warping how the game is played almost. So this card is, yeah, absolutely absurd. Capturing Aroma could add on to your ball search, but I do think that other cards will come in ahead of it, especially because it doesn't have the word ball in its name. It's a tough ask for this sort of card, but, there are times when it's a little bit better than an early Nest Ball if you see it, sort of later on in the game. So could be a decent option. And Gift Energy for these sorts of decks that don't necessarily have the best draw engines to fall back on. Possibly if you're adding in Guzmahala or stuff like that, you could fall back on this Gift Energy because it can top you up on a good number of cards, which is a nice thing to fall back on to protect yourself from N, from Marnie, these sorts of things, which are prevalent. So I could see Gift Energy squeezing into some sort of list. Like, definitely Grass is one of those decks that I think of immediately that doesn't have many good draw engine Pokemon. It has like Roserade and a great amount of tutor from Grottle and possibly even Grovyle, but it lacks the actual physical draw a lot of the time. So having a gift sneak into the list can give you a bit of safety against hand disruption, which is pretty cool. Onto the type-specific stuff, and Grass is actually pretty interesting. There is a Beautifly Stage 2 that can allow you to actually draw until you have 6 cards in hand. It's a Stage 2, and typically Grass is already playing a ton of Stage 2, so I don't think there's actually space for a card like this, but it's not necessarily a bad Pokemon. And if you are playing maybe a Meganium combo list with multiple Stage 2s all over the shop, you could try the 101 Beautifly line to protect yourself again from hand disruption. Ivysaur, a minor upgrade here, where you can have that Summoning Aroma attack available to you. You have 100 hit points, you're still Heavy Ball searchable. Definitely a nice upgrade here. And a potential new direction for Grass, which I'm really excited about. This Sunflora is a crazy beat stick. For just 2 colors, you do 10 and 70 more for each energy you discard from your hand, up to 3. So you can hit 220, which is absolutely crazy with the bright beam. It's almost like a baby Blacephalon, really, in a lot of ways. And Grass can actually support this pretty well because you already have the Gossifleur Eldegoss that can get basic energies out of the deck for you. So you can just have a lot of energy recycle cards and try and churn and burn the Sunflora. You've got Revitalizer, you've got Rescue Carrier. There's a few ways you can try and recycle this card. And you can have just crazy damage output potential. So it could be a potential build around. I know it's a bit of a glass cannon because it only has 90 hit points, but man, does it smack. And even just having Gossifleur and the Sunflora as like a mini package in your deck, or Eldegoss I should say, as a mini package to give you beat stick potential through, you know, some big Stage 2s, it can be a nice card that comes in, you know, as a bit part player and scores big knockouts. So that's a real nice include for Grass that's really been the focal point has been either some big basics or your Stage 2s, and there's not really been that in between, but now having a sort of mid-range Stage 1 is a pretty cool thing to see. Onto Fire, I really like this Charizard. There's actually a good number of other Charizards that can go around Fire, but I do think the Burn Brightly Pokemon Gozard actually gives a lot of license for Fire to be much better, because it normally, the identity of Fire is having very high energy attack costs, and they're kind of difficult to maintain, even with Blacksmith, even with Welder. But now having Burn Brightly on top of this means that it's just that much easier to maintain these silly and high damage and powerful fire attackers if you just have the Zard chilling on the bench. So I do think this is a decent option for you. Fire is one of these decks that does have a good amount of draw and such. It's just been lacking the right efficient attackers, and I think Burn Brightly is what turns most of these things into more efficient attackers, especially because, again, Flare Blitz could chip in if you need it to. Because it's pretty efficient when you consider the Burn Brightly text here as well. Rapidash also really interesting with that heat boost, buffing your fire attacks by 30. I feel like, again, there could be this the sort of the basic fire deck that has this heat boost available to it now to push the damage output from early tempo attackers like Volcanion, like the other Moltres, not the one that's on screen, but a few other little options that we have here in basic form. Rapidash pushing that tempo and turning this fire deck into a nice little beat stick of a deck. You already like having some energy recursion style cards in your deck, like Fire Crystal, Energy Retrieval, if you are playing Salazzle. So Rapidash, Salazzle kind of go hand in hand. They're really decent options to go together, because then you can really warp your deck around recycling fire energy, and that's kind of like the identity of the list that you make. So that can be pretty cool. Sort of in that same category, the Moltres can be a nice little 10 extra damage augment if you really want it to. So do bear that in mind. And just a small thing, if you are playing Delphox in your fire deck, the one that can draw up to 6 cards, I think that's probably still the best one, even though we get a new Delphox which can potentially do a lot of damage for relatively efficient attack cost. I think I still like having the draw engine of a Mystical Fire more often than not, but the Fennekin can search for a supporter, so it's certainly an upgrade, at least in the basic. Maybe you could also consider the new Delphox if you wanted to counter possibly the likes of Werelord that we'll be looking at in a moment. Actually, we'll be looking at it right now because we are moving into water. So the Werelord, yeah, the big jumbo-sized boy over here certainly is jumbo-sized. I mean, this card is silly. 200 base hit points with an inbuilt reduction of 30. That's a pot helmet inbuilt, which is one of the premium tools of this format. And don't forget that you could also put a pot helmet on top of this guy. It's basically a tag team at that point. 260 effective hit points to one-hit KO it. And if you're not one-shotting the well, it's going to get the double dip of that reduction. So that's absolutely absurd, especially because it can pack a 240 damage attack. Absolutely monstrous. It does require 4 energy, one of them being a special. So it's by no means easy, but water already has splash energy. You can quite easily see things like capture or recycle energy come into the list. There's even a good number of like unit energies and auroras that you could be using with the whales, so it shouldn't be too difficult to get this rolling alongside Frostmoth and Blastoise. Just the same shell that we've seen with previous whale lords, we just get an even bigger whale, which is pretty crazy overall. Some other options as well. Basculegion, this could be a new combo deck alongside an old Gyarados. Gyarados throwing a ton of waters into the discard pile, and this can be your sort of reload of energy, which is kind of an interesting deck. So that's a decent option to have in mind. Slowbro from Pokemon Go. Don't really see this coming into many lists because there is a good amount of archetypes that can choose to play around the Twilight Inspiration here and there. And it is still one of these cards that you have to time and play around N and all this other stuff throughout the entire game. But it can be a way that you can catch up in matchups, which is not to be understated. Lake Acuity could make your Pokemon even more tanky. Again, just adding to this Werelord tank ability if you really want to. You can have the lake, you can have the pots, you can be reducing so much damage, and this Werelord could be a monster threat. Another alternative avenue, thanks to the Swim Freely from Seadra, means we could power up a couple of Kingdras. The one that we have on screen here could be one of them, but there's also one that can move energies from the Kingdra when it gets knocked out onto other things. So that's kind of interesting as well, with a higher damage output threshold. The Kingdra on the slide, though, is one that can force shuffling for both players. Sorry, for either player. So that's a nice way to keep your opponent's hand in check. Can be very nice against like colorless control and a few other things where you're keeping a few of these really expansive hand style decks with tons of draw engine and keeping them really in line, which I think is very nice to give decks constant disruption, especially because it comes onto a 150 hit point body that can just hit a vanilla 130. That's actually pretty, just reasonable in general, so not a bad option to be weaving in a Kingdra package to your decks, especially because we have the Swim Freely package with Finian now as well to keep in mind. Onto Lightning, not too much that's that exciting, just a couple potential basic upgrades. There's a Pikachu now that you can attach to and move out of the active with, which can be pretty handy. And there's a Tynamo. Obviously, we have a Free Retreat Tynamo with 30 hit points, so it's tough competition, and we have a number of 40 hit point Dynamos. But if your preference is to have an attack that can search your deck for a Pokemon and get it directly to the hand, it could be pretty okay. And we know that Pokemon Tutor is really, really premium when we play one-ofs, so getting you directly into your Electric if you're not under pressure, or if you're getting into the Flaffy or some other setup Pokemon, that could be a really big deal for you. I personally won't be going for this Dynamo, but I thought it was an option worth discussing. Onto Psychic. This Curlier is massive for Psychic. I'm so excited to see this inclusion as someone who likes playing a lot of Psychic myself. Refinement, allowing you to discard a card from your hand and draw 2, is monster text. This is absolutely massive, specifically for Psychic as well, because it already has access to Malamar. So giving yourself more discard synergy for Psychic energy is massive. It just gets those energies circulating that discard pile for you to recycle back into play, so an excellent card to have here. Not only that, of course, we know that Curlier is a blessed evolution chain because we have a number of Gallades and Gardevoirs, which are both very exciting. We have the Buddy Catch Gallade, which is kind of my front runner right now, that can tutor supporter cards and allows you to get very creative with your supporter line and cherry pick the right ones for the right moments. So it means you can get cheeky by adding in like Delinquents and whatnot, and they actually become Power Spike cards because you can get it at the right time, which is very, very cool. There's also a couple of decent Guardies, but the one I think that's also pretty handy is the one that can draw cards but also accelerate energy if they're in the top 2. I think that sort of turns your trade into just free card advantage without having the downside of a discard. So yeah, really like the Curlier package. Psychic was already very strong, and I think just getting that little bit of draw, especially early game draw, to go alongside your Mashana now gives you just more consistency that you had previously. So just excellent to be a great include for this deck. Onto fighting stuff again, finally getting a front runner attacker. I think fighting has been one of the weakest types in GLC for a decent amount of time, but Machamp has, similar to Werelord, some of the silliest stats available, with a base of 150 that can go all the way up to 300 hit points if you have 3, or if your opponent has 3 or few prizes remaining. Not only that, again, Strong Arm Lariats can do a pretty decent chunk for just 2 fighting energy. you do 100 and 100 more if you do during your next turn this Pokemon can't attack. We know that we can play the Bird Keepers, we can play the Tantalizers, we can get in and out with Armachamp if we have to, so hitting that flat 200, very reasonable, especially when we have great damage mods for the fighting types. We have Dojo, we have Strong Energy, we have obviously other tools that can help us out here, so a late game beat stick of Machamp sounds incredible to me, and you know, fighting really has been struggling. You've been working with Hitmons for the longest time. You've been working with Donphan, possibly. We've been working with Garchomp Lucario. All of these things haven't really had the staying power to be worthwhile in GLC. And now this sort of late game goal of getting towards a Machamp is just so appealing. That I can see it being a huge problem for many archetypes out here. And it's a foil to the Lightning deck as well, which is one of the sort of problems of GLC right now, I would say. Or I would say one of the strongest archetypes just in general is Lightning, just for how efficient it can maintain its attackers with Flaffy and Electric. So having some fighting type coverage, as well as having a Machoke, which is already really good at protecting your bench, you actually have a pretty good matchup into Lightning now, and it's maybe a spanner in the works for that archetype. Fighting stuff as well, very good into like colorless control stuff in general, because you have so much aggression with your fighting dudes, and you're hitting for so many weaknesses. So yeah, I think these are all important things, and it's good to see fighting come to the table now that we have this Machamp as your late game win condition in a lot of ways. There are some other interesting cards as well. Lake Acuity again, giving you some more tank ability, which is nice if you want to lean down that direction. We already have Stone fighting energy, so we could get tank if we want to. We have a Carbink that can get some item cards directly into the hand, which could be handy just for setup here and there if you really want it to. Not bad for an early game Pokemon. We just want setup Pokemon in general for fighting. That's still one of the things we're kind of starved of. Really do lack draw support Pokemon, and looking towards things like Garcario still is your best engine. Is pretty resource intensive. This will definitely be a deck that can take advantage of Arizu, for example, crying out for a card like that, honestly, but also having a Carbink as an early game option just to try and get some ball search going and whatnot could be an option for you as well. And then Metacham's actually an interesting stage 1. That battle step for a fighting does 50, and you can search your deck for 2 fighting energy and attach them to your benched Pokemon in any way that you like. Actually not too bad. 110 hit points on a stage 1. Pretty reasonable. 50, not a great number, but it can set up some stuff for you whilst getting some energy acceleration going, which again, not the easiest thing to do in fighting. We obviously have some great tools that can reduce our attack costs. We have Raihan and counter energy. We have ways that we can like pseudo accelerate, but not many like clean ways of doing it, and a Metacham does offer that if you really want to, so it could be an option. Onto the dark stuff, some more interesting things at play here. Just a quick note for Honchkrow. I probably think it doesn't quite make the build because dark is actually a really competitive type with a lot of good stuff. But Night Cyclone can do a 160 and you get to move those energies off the Honchkrow, which does have some appeal because you're getting a huge chunk of damage and then being able to not worry about the resources of what it's giving up can be really nice. You can start throwing energies onto a Guzzlord after this, for example, and just have multiple threats powered up across the board. I personally think it won't make the cut, but it could be an option. Alolan Raticate could be pretty interesting. Actually, I think alongside the Crobat as well, because they're both triple acceleration users that both work well in a poison-based build of Dark. Could actually see play together, and I also think part of the reason would this be because you have Free Retreat Zubat now, but also there are Free Retreat Alolan Rattatas, and the reason I mention Free Retreat so much is because these are probably going to feature in a poison-based build that has Galarian Weezing. So having natural free retreaters in your deck makes the consistency of getting the turn 1 attack off with your coughing that little bit more. You basically give yourself additional good leads in the deck, which is really important. So I could foresee 2 triple acceleration / double colorless lovers coming together in a deck. The Raticate can allow you to get through some silly walls, basically the Machamp we just discussed, the Werelord we just discussed, other big stage 2s out there like, what's it called? Torterra, so many big things out here that the Dark deck obviously can deal with, but normally it works towards the late game where the Galarian Moltres is doing the heavy lifting in terms of high damage output. But in the early game, maybe the Raticate can come in and deal with an initial threat, which could be a big deal. And again, when you have Lost City potentially in the mix, you can Super Fang and use Lost City and Garbodor to finish them off, which could be pretty nice for you. And yeah, the Crobat being able to take 2 additional prize cards. You're only doing 30 damage, but yeah, it's not a bad thing at all. 2 additional prize cards is just quite silly. And again, you have a lot of sort of counter manipulation at our disposal in Dark. We have potential for Zigzagoon and Obstagoon to put damage onto things, and we're likely putting this in a poison package that's going to be putting an amount of counters on between turns, and you can sort of find the appropriate moment to strike with your Crobat. And this doesn't have to hit the active, it's one of your opponent's Pokemon, so you can also be hitting something that they've retreated to the back, which could also be nice. Speaking of the poison package, Toxapex could be an interesting 1 energy attacker here. The Venoshock doing 10 base, but 120 more if your opponent's Pokemon is poisoned. So again, alongside Garbodor, it could be a decent option for you, just for an efficient 1 energy attacker in the list. Onto Metal, it looks like a lonely slide, but Klinklang is actually massive, giving this deck a little bit more of a push in terms of energy acceleration is definitely welcome, because there are a plethora of really good metal attackers. They're just kind of expensive, and only relying on 1 Metal Link's Bronzong can be a little bit awkward here and there. Even possibly, because we have this Klinklang now, we can move away from Metal Links and go towards Metal Transfer instead, knowing that we can get the burst acceleration from this guy, and it means that we can get greedy with some possible net plays or some Acerola plays, that sort of stuff, with our chunky metal type dudes, which we know is sort of the build around of metal in general, so really welcome inclusion for those decks. Onto Dragon, again, doesn't look like much, but Lance is essentially a more flexible Arizu. It's similar to Colorless in that they have Winona. Lance is a great inclusion for the Dragon decks, which are setup based to say the least. Of course, they do have Gabite that can already tutor a ton of Dragon Pokemon, but seeing this card in the opening stages is just the dream. You can get multiple basics, you can get that Gabite to hand, which is crazy, and you can just get rolling in the game. I do really like Dragon as well. It's a fun pet type to try out. There's some very powerful basics as well as some stage 2s to work towards. So I think Lance fits that build really nicely and will be a definite include for Dragon decks. Onto Colorless, still one of the most flexible, one of the most dangerous types in the GLC. We have, first of all, the sort of control package to the right of the screen here, where we have Pokestop potentially if you're just trying to dig to the bottom of your deck and get some recycle going with the likes of Bunnelby and whatnot. The Pokestop could have very little downside, especially if your ratios are very item focused. Misfortune Sisters could be a way to get certain items, removed from the opponent's card pool, so can aggressively sort of attack their hand and remove resources. Their deck, of course, remove resources. I think Belelba could still be the stronger option, but the Misfortune Sisters doesn't have the sort of awkwardness of you removing your own cards from deck. There's so many good Snorlax in GLC, but the block one could be an alternative avenue if you're going to try and trap some specific things from the opponent and force them to have their Guzmas, their VS Seekers, their Bird Keepers, that sort of thing. Something to bear in mind. Blissey, just with that 200 hit points and an option of healing one of your benched Pokemon, could be a way to, again, take advantage of Acerola, Sharon's Care, these sorts of cards, try and sit out of range of the majority of the format, and just heal off stuff to buy turns and sort of be a passive mill deck could be an interesting option as well from Pokemon Go. Ditto sits in a sort of, could be an aggressive option, could be a control option as well, just such a very strong card, because we are a singleton formats. The fact that you can copy something from your discard pile essentially cheats that rule. So you can be very flexible with a number of different attackers sort of in your discard pile. You could have anything from Baby Doll Eyes, from Lillipup into Bunnelby when you need it to, all this other stuff that Ditto can take advantage of. And it can be really annoying for control, but also could give you some attacking prowess as well if you really need to, which is very, very tempting. Another Snorlax that, again, just has silly numbers available to it. 150 hit points is huge for a basic. 180 damage for 3 colorless is also monstrous. So, yeah, very, very strong card here. And Archeops could come alongside or possibly even replace the Porygon Z sort of aggressive colorless builds in the format. Primal Turbo, as we know, really silly ability. We don't have Lugia V-Star to cheat this guy out, so you are doing it the old-fashioned way. But I think the payoff is still massive when Colorless can still take advantage of so many great special energy in this format. Being able to tutor them straight from the deck is absolutely ridiculous, to be honest. So yeah, Archeops still looking pretty promising going forwards, and I think an aggressive colorless deck could end up being pretty strong alongside the control package. One quick note on control. it has amazing tools, but I'm actually very, very hopeful that Lost City makes colorless control a way worse archetype. I may just be living on a cloud right now and hoping that everyone's going to add Lost City to their decks. I think it's the correct thing to do, but I think this naturally is a real problem for controlling archetypes, which are trying to recycle so much and make themselves infinite and provide all these different awkward avenues or whatever. A Lost City knocking out a key component and putting it in a lost zone where it's inaccessible can completely make those tactics crumble. And I'm really excited for GLC in a world with Lost City. Even though I've said that Lost City is going to be one of these cards to watch and could be on that ban list at some point, the fact that it actually keeps control at bay a little bit is very promising for this format. And I think I personally have been crying out for more hits to colors control. I still think it's by far the best deck in the game pre-Lost City. So now that we have this sort of inbuilt answer that is just already a good card in a huge number of matchups, as just a mainstream card that can be a spanner in the works for control, I think that's actually pretty massive, and colorless control players have to be on their toes these days. One final note then, I have gone through all the types that I wanted to, but I am adding to my cube Koga a cube all based around the GLC format. I'm hoping that this can be another resource on top of the fantastic GLC website that we have that's produced by Andrew Mahone, and I've even linked it in the description there of my cube. But if you just go onto the website, Cube Koga, and you look for GLC Formats Archive, there will be a number of cards in the cube itself, which I think are some of the highlight cards in each type. And I'm going to have, ideally, a number of decks ready to rumble. You can see I'm trying to get at least one of each type, and I'll probably go down the rabbit hole on a few of the colors that I prefer the most. The likes of Dark, the likes of Psychic, the likes of Water, Metal as well. These are some of my personal favorites. These are ones that I'll be experimenting with more, and probably add a couple other variations in there as well, just for my current lists really. They're not meant to be sort of taken as gospel, not meant to be perfect 60s. There's actually a lot of individual takes on the GLC where you can really add your own flair to a list, and there is still a ton of creativity. I don't want to stifle that at all. I just want these to be starting points for people just jumping into the format, of course. Obviously, the cube list itself will be a massive resource, basically showing you a catalogue of the most interesting, most important cards in most types as well. So if you're just focusing on one type, it can be really easy for you to just skip down to that block and just sort of take note of what could be in your specific card pool, whilst not having to scroll through like PKMN cards or your collection on PCGO and have to cut out all these other things. The cube list does it for you very efficiently. So yeah, you can see my current lists. I'm hoping to update them every time a new set comes out. It shouldn't be too difficult to do that. But they should just be more of a sort of inspiration piece rather than you have to play this perfect 60 that I've created, because I'm still novice at GLC myself. I only get the opportunity to play it with friends here and there. It's not something that I'm doing full-time or anything close to that. It's not even close to my main focus. It's almost always standard among everything else. But yeah, it is something I'm still passionate about, still something I like to dip my toe in every now and then, and it is still something that I like to jam with friends. So let me know down below what you think about the new inclusions from the most recent sets, and let me know what you think about the Kyogre ban. Do you think there are any other cards on the chopping block? I'd like to hear your thoughts on Lost City as well, and how impactful that's going to be on the GLC format. I'm low-key terrified that if the opponent just gets an early Guzma Lost City combo against certain archetypes, they just win. So a bit of a worry there. Thanks so much for listening today. Make sure you do check out the gymleaderchallenge.com website and, of course, Tricky Jim's Discord. He is the creator of the format and still does a ton of great content on there. And there's even more discussion to be had within that Discord. I don't want to take anything away from those resources. These are hopefully just adding to that mix. And let me know your thoughts of some of the lists that I have already up there. I only have a few right now. I don't even have one for every single type. But the ones I do have, worth checking out. And I think over the course of the week, I'll be adding more. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.